The city palace was a lot more luxurious than Abel had initially imagined. In the center of the garden, there was an enormous fountain. Its spring water danced as mysterious beams of orange light sparkled upon its surface. Every servant in the city palace who guided the visitors were dressed in all black uniforms with impeccable manners. The surrounding guards were all dressed in half-body armor, holding a long sword in each of their hands. They all gave out the imposing manner of a professional with level 4 or above training in combat G. The place was manifesting the extraordinaire of the royal viscounts. There were 3 main occupations in the city palace: warriors, knights, and assassins. Regardless of class, the training was centered around practicing the combat G, which had the potential to bring out some very extraordinary abilities. Warriors were among one of the most common occupations, mostly because they took a large proportion of combat G practitioners. They were well trained to use almost any weapons, including swords, hammer, and long spears. Knights harnessed the greatest fighting ability out of the 3 occupations. Their resourcefulness enabled them to receive well-rounded training at a young age, allowing them to receive the best equipment there was. Unlike the other classes, they would ride on war horses and wear helmets on top of their heads. The least common occupation was the assassin because, on top of the practice of combat G, they also needed to practice large amounts of hiding techniques. Assassins have the most intense combat G explosion. However, it would often take a toll on the stamina. It was hard to earn a title in the Duchy of Carmel. Every generation of kings continued to suppress the number of nobles through a series of regulations, such as the prohibition for females to inherit powerful statuses. Another big one would be the rank lowering of lords who did not possess their own lands. For every time that a title was inherited, a landless lord, every title inherited would be lowered by 1 rank. Worst of all, however, was the claiming of territories of heirless lords who have passed away. Due to all sorts of interferences by the nobles, many lord families have ceased to remain to this day. There was only one condition to attain a title, and that was to do a great service for the duchy. It was especially hard in peaceful times like these, so that's why countless nobles would be willing to be on the front lines whenever it was called for. In recent years, tensions were strained between the king and the nobles. Major noble families continued to increase the power, while the king looked for every chance he could to execute anyone who dared, showing his desire to seize power from him. If you want to know how low the status of nobles was in Duchy of Carmel, just compare it to the city owner of Harvest City. Such an enormous city could be owned by a viscount, while other similar-sized cities such as the neighboring Duchy of Thunder were at least owned by someone with the title of a duke. Of course, these things were still way too far-fetched for Abel, a Knight of Martial had already gained his fiefdom through his outstanding military service. So he did not care about things such as a title. When they were on the horse carriage, he only casually mentioned it Abel out of interest while they were on the topic of the city owners. After Abel had seen the guards in the city palace, he couldn't help but remember how the Knight of Martial had told him that the major nobles were becoming more powerful to resist the king. Every single one of the hundreds of warriors here was a professional. Even the ones with the lowest ranking, 100 of them could easily be just as capable as an army of 1,000. The crowd had gathered in the hall. However, Abel was disappointed with the food offered by the city palace. Because it was winter, the buffet table was only filled with cakes and roasted meats, but the wine was only supplied adequately. Before the cocktail party officially began, Viscount Dickens stepped out and commenced his speech. Even though the hall was crowded with people, Viscount Dickens was able to deliver the sound of his speech to everyone's ears through the power of his combat G. According to the Knight of Martial, this annual event was a way for the Viscounts to showcase their wealth and military power, and that they were well capable of managing this enormous land. It was the most boring cocktail party Abel had ever been to. He did not know a single person here. After the Knight of Martial had introduced Abel to a few of his friends, Abel soon returned to the corner of the hall, quietly looking over this top of the world gathering. No wonder there was not much food prepared. Most people only stood around chatting with a wine glass in their hands. Rarely did anyone show interest in the food. Abel had dashed around the streets all day, and all the dreary chatters in the hall just sounded like a lullaby. By this point, Abel's eyelids were getting heavier and heavier, and slowly he drifted asleep. It was only after the party had ended that Abel was woken up by the shake of the Knight of Marshall. Knight of Marshall continued to make fun of Abel as they were going back to the temporary house. A level 5 novice knight had dashed around the streets all day and fell asleep during a cocktail party. How could any knight believe this? Early next morning, Knight of Marshall took Abel on the carriage to return to Harry Castle. As the housekeeper Robin was sending the carriage out the front gate, Abel stuck his head out and waved goodbye. It was at that moment the spying servant who had been frozen in the courtyard for the entire night realized Abel was about to leave. So immediately he rushed back to his owner to report. "What? They are heading towards Southgate." "Are you sure?" said Joshua after he heard the servant's report. "If it's true, immediately gather the men." Josh's father was a lord because he was good at managing businesses. He owned more than 10 stores on the main road of Harvest City and held more than 50% of the shares from the Harvest City clothing market. He was a true royal businessman. Because of this large amount of wealth, his only son, Joshua, had been able to receive the highest quality of education. At age 19 he was already a level 4 novice knight, and father had always dreamed that he could one day win a battle and gain a fiefdom. Because of this, Josh's father was never hesitated to invest in Joshua's development. For example, just look at the sword of 100 skills his father bought him for his education, and upon losing the gambling bet, Joshua had no intention to tell his father. The first thing that came to his mind was to seek revenge and then find the chance to tell his father in the future. He gathered 12 of the most powerful servants in the family, each equipped with their own war horse and long sword. Joshua was on a blazing red warhorse, and they set off to strike in a team of 13. The Knight of Marshall sat in the carriage, enjoying the wine his friend gave him during his time in Harvest City. Despite the vigorous movement of the carriage, the Knight of Marshall was able to move leisurely, so the wine glass did not budge a single bit. Abel, on the other hand, was trying his best to copy this knight's riding position. However, the carriage these days were just too shaky. There was virtually no means for any sort of shock absorption. When the seats began to vibrate, Abel had no ways to stop the wine from falling out of his cup. Still, the boy was not going to be demotivated by small drawbacks such as this. Instead, he observed the Knight of Marshall as closely as he could, meanwhile preparing to imitate the same kind of skills that were displayed right in front of him. The carriage horse was old and slow. Its speed often did not coordinate with the speed of the carriage. Therefore the 13 men had caught up to the carriage in no time. A malevolent smile began to emerge from Josh's emotionless face. "Interesting, our carriage is being followed," said the Knight of Marshall. He lowered his wine glass with a cold smile on his face. Abel had also felt something odd from the vibration of the ground. He looked at the Knight of Marshall. Since he did not bring his long sword to the cocktail party, he could only put arrows on his bracelet and use it as a bow. "Go ahead, stop the carriage. I'll take care of the people inside," Joshua ordered the 12 servants. If Joshua saw the carriage from the front, he would have noticed the royal engraving and would not have proceeded with his plan. The 12 servants raised their long sword and charged towards the carriage. The carriage driver knew that Knight of Marshall was inside, so he was no worried. He only shouted, "This carriage was owned by the Harry family. Attackers will not be punished lightly." However, the 12 servants did not know that Knight of Marshall's surname was Harry. Therefore, they continued to charge and stopped the carriage. After Joshua had caught up with them, he saw an eye-catching white unicorn engraving in the front of the carriage. It sent shivers from the back of his spine to the top of his head. He realized he had attacked a noble's carriage, and from the calm expression of the driver, he knew the other party must have held great power. By this point, Joshua was on the road of no return. Nothing could change the fact that he had attacked Noble's carriage. The desire to kill continued to rage in his heart. If he just killed this driver and that little blacksmith inside, who would have guessed he was a murderer? Kill them all, Joshua spat out the words viciously. The 12 servants hesitated. They never killed someone, and they didn't have the will to. The most they've done were things like abusing their master's adversaries, maybe chopping off their limbs if things went bad. However, since it was a direct order from their master, these pitiful souls had no choice but to charge on with their long sword in hand. In a blink of an eye, a dark figure holding a long sword suddenly burst out through the waving curtain of the carriage. It was the Knight of Marshall. The second before the servants' swords made contact with the carriage driver, a powerful flash of combat chi shot out from his sword, cutting the servants and their horses into two. Fresh blood exploded from the bodies meters above the ground. The place was raining in blood, and the few servants up the back were drenched. The servants were terrified, yet the Knight of Marshall did not show mercy. He hopped from the carriage and slashed a servant head off with his long sword in midair. Before the servant even had time to react, his brain had already flown out his skull and landed in front of Joshua's horse. Joshua was stunned by this horrific scene. His body started to feel weak, and he fell from his horse on the spot. In a split second, the Knight of Marshall had already annihilated 10 servants. The other 5 were no longer on their horse holding their long swords, but shivering on the ground. Their opponent was an official knight that understood how to use combat chi. After witnessing the fighting power of a knight, these everyday servants would remember this traumatic experience throughout the rest of their lives. Abel was also stunned by the Knight of Marshall's viciousness and directness. Normally, the Knight of Marshall always wore a smile on his face, but what had just happened gave Abel a completely new impression of him. "Sir, you are a great knight. I am the eldest son of Lord Joel. I demand to be granted the title of noble prisoner of war," stuttered Joshua to the Knight of Marshall. The title, noble prisoner of war, as a way to treat nobles who had committed war crimes during that period. According to the knight's system of rule, winning or losing a battle was not the most important factor. What mattered was that they gave the best performance and faced their opponent with glory. Therefore, being a prisoner of war for a knight was not such a shameful thing. On top of that, most knights held great economic and political power. After they became a prisoner of war, all they need to do was to pay a ransom to be released. For example, if a higher-ranking knight high-level lord had been captured, the lower-level knights were obligated to turn themselves into hostages in exchange for ransoms. Lastly, these battles were common back in the days, so being captured as a prisoner happened often. Therefore, prisoners of war were often treated kindly and released only on the condition of a ransom. Knight of Marshall sneered at the hopeless novice knight who was shivering on the floor in front of him before even giving a fight. The Knight of Marshall wondered if he should deal with this situation according to the noble treatment of granting him the title of noble prisoner of war. "Joshua," said Abel as he hopped off the carriage. Looking at Joshua on the floor, Abel never could have guessed this noble brother had gotten people to attack him because of such a small conflict. "You know him?" Knight Marshall asked. He had vaguely sensed the reason for this attack, but even if there were conflicts in the city, a knight would rarely gather a bunch of people and plan an unexpected attack. After thinking to himself for a while, the Knight of Marshall decided to let Abel have the say on what happens to Joshua. It would also be a good chance to train his decision-making skills, or so it was intended. "Abel, how do you want to deal with him?" asked the Knight of Marshall. Abel didn't care if Joshua was dead or alive. Whatever the decision was, there wouldn't be a benefit in harming this pitiful prick. That being said, Joshua wasn't completely useless. Abel decided to take advantage of this, and by take advantage, he was hoping that the Knight of Marshall wouldn't mind him making some extra money. "Let's bring you back to the castle, Joshua. I'll let you enjoy the title of noble prisoner of war." After the Knight of Marshall had heard Abel's word, he gave out a faint smile of satisfaction. Abel did not act according to his anger but decided to take advantage of Joshua's wealth to contribute to the development of the castle. Abel's train of thought was pretty simple. Joshua's fighting abilities were miles behind him. If Joshua was a real knight and was able to pose a threat to him, he would have chosen otherwise, because an enemy is always better when dead. Abel then took the 5 surviving servants' belts off their waist and tied it around their hands. Other than that unlucky horse who had been chopped into 2 pieces by the knight of Marshal, Abel and the carriage driver threw Joshua and the captivated servants on the 11 surviving horses. After the horses had lined up, they began to move while Abel sat on Joshua's blazing red color horse following from behind. Joshua was tied to the first horse in the line. Although his belt had also been taken off much like the other servants, Abel intentionally did not use it to tie up his hands. This is because if he tries to escape, his pants would fall off. But Joshua was not stupid. He would not dare to escape in front of an official knight. It was only until now Joshua had realized he had attacked the owner of Harry's castle, and that person whom he called Little Blacksmith would inherit all of Harry's castle. At that moment Joshua knew the first thing he would do after he returns to his castle was to kill the servant responsible for spying Abel. After they returned to Harry's castle, Abel gave the captives to Linz the housekeeper. Housekeepers were responsible for settling the ransoms. Other than that, they would not question a single thing since it was the noble's problem. All they need to do is to identify the captive's status and negotiate the amount of money they need to pay with the other party's housekeeper. Soon Abel had resumed his daily schedule. Every morning after breakfast he would exercise and forge metal at the blacksmith shop. At night he would return to the castle to practice the knight's breathing techniques and follow with a good night of sleep. Just like this, another month had gone by. Abel had forged over 5 long swords of 100 skills only using the technique of this world. He did not use any special carburization or dipping fire techniques. This is because the only rule of forging in here was to make Master Bentham happy. No matter how good your secret techniques are, the fundamentals were the most important. Thus, through Abel's respect for fundamentals techniques these past months, he had been greatly praised by Master Bentham. One morning when Abel was at the blacksmith shop, he was called by Master Bentham to go to the master's private office. Abel followed Master Bentham into the room within the office, and from the top corner of the room, Master Bentham took out a thick heavy book from a metal box. My teacher was the dwarf forging master, Master Robin. During the time dwarfs and human allied to combat the orc, thus every day I was sent off to practice forging with the dwarfs, said Master Bentham. Master Bentham's eyes began to sparkle as he recalled the good old days. It seemed as though he was mumbling to himself as he told Abel the stories about his past. Those were the best days of my life. Every day I could learn something new. The dwarfs were some of the most gifted beings when it comes to forging, and through thousands of years of perfecting their forging techniques it was truly unlike others. Legend has it the most powerful dwarfs were used to responsible for making artifacts for the gods. Other than making normal weapons, Master Robin could also make magical weapons. I remembered when I saw magical weapons for the first time. I knew I would dedicate my life to be a blacksmith. I remember telling myself that one day I would also want to make weapons like this. I tried very hard to master all the things Master Robin taught me, and only on the day I mastered all of it, I asked Master Robin if he could teach me how to make magical weapons. He rejected me without a second thought, said I didn't have the talent for it. Master Bentham got a bit emotional from his speech. However, Master Robin did give me one last hope when I finished all my studies, and that is this magical weapon forging guide. After I searched around in the guide, I realized that the reason why I could not make magical weapons is because of spiritual power. A person's spiritual power is the main thing when it comes to unleashing the magical force within a weapon. Yet most people who possess spiritual power would become a wizard. No one would want to be a blacksmith until I met you. Abel had suddenly been moved by these words from Master Bentham. All this time, he had been seeking information about wizards, and it is the first time he had heard a person directly talk about magic to him. Abel, I am already old. I know I could never be able to forge a magical weapon in this life, but you are my student. I hope you can one day be able to forge a magical weapon," said Master Bentham with eyes full of hope. "Master, I will try my best," Abel nodded earnestly. Master Bentham picked up that enormous magical weapon forging guide in an almost ritualistic manner and passed it on to Abel's hand. The book felt heavy on Abel's hand. Just like the legend has it, even though dwarfs were short, they always believed they were the descendants of the giants. Therefore they tried to make everything as big as possible, and this book is a beautiful manifestation of that. When Abel opened the book, he realized the information was very straightforward. First page, fire magical weapons. In the middle of the page, drawings were depicting both sides of a sword. On the top there were strange markings, while on the handle of the blade there was a concave area with markings saying, "Put fire magic gem here." At the bottom of the page there was information about the function of fire-type magical weapons. Fire potions formula and the fighting power of the weapon. The second page, ice-type magical weapons. The layout was the same as the first page. Drawing of depicting both sides of a sword in the middle, and explanation and formulas about ice magical weapons at the bottom. The third page was about lighting magical weapons, and the fourth page was about toxic magical weapons. There were only 4 pages in this book. Abel thought to himself, the dwarfs are ridiculous. They must be stupid to make such an enormous book with only 4 pages of information. But looking back at Master Bentham's sincere expression, Abel did not say it out loud. "I have all the materials you need. Although I had been collecting them for many years, it is only recently that I've found the perfect fire magical gems and ice magical gems," Master Bentham said. Meanwhile, he opened a box that contained all the things that he had just mentioned. "Is this it? Within those materials, some things looked very familiar, Abel." It was 3 red gems and 3 blue gems. He took the 6 gems out of the box and inspected them carefully. They were the ones he sold at Harvest City earlier. "These are the fire magical gems and ice magical gems I was talking about. It was so hard to find such perfect ones like these, but luckily I had found these in Harvest City." Looking at how excited Master Bentham was, Abel wondered if the price of these gems were much higher than the price he had sold them for. If he mistakenly sold magical gems as normal gems, what would be the actual value of magical gems? But Abel decided not to ask. He did want to regret his decision even further. "Your task in the future will be sketching out those runes. Make sure the angle, force, and the thickness of the strokes are the same," Master Bentham repeatedly emphasized as he took out a brush from a box. "Is this an ink brush?" Abel was shocked once again. Ink brushes were one of those things that Abel was all too familiar with. From the tip of the brush to the body of the brush, this brush that Master Bentham was holding looked exactly like an ink brush from Abel's original world. Master Bentham explained as he handed the rune brush over. "Abel, ink brush. I like that name, but it's called the rune brush, boy." The body of the brush was made out of a kind of wood that is resistant to magic, which prohibits other external magical force interrupting the rune's writing process. The tip of the brush was made out of the softest handful of fur located in the very back of a wind wolf's head. The wind property of a wind wolf allowed the brush to deliver rune's ink more efficiently. This rune brush is very difficult to master. There are lots of training and learning you need to do until you can draw the lines of the rune correctly. "Here, give it a try," said Master Bentham to Abel as he took out a bottle filled with normal ink. He opened the lid and placed it on the table. Then, he took out a piece of lambskin parchment and also placed it on the table. Abel held the rune brush by gripping it between his middle finger and the ring finger, while his thumb pressed against the body of the brush. He then proceeded to dip the brush in the ink bottle and gently whipped off the excess ink. I glanced at the runes in the book. In one take he read down the entire first page. Master Bentham was stunned as he watched by the side. The master himself had been practicing to use a rune brush for more than 20 years. Yet his position and control of the rune brush were not even as good as Abel's first attempt. Even basic things such as grasping the amount of ink the brush needed to be dipped had taken Master Bentham countless trial and errors. Although there was still a bit of disparity when it came to Abel's replication of the runes. He was able to recognize when the lines should be smoothed straight or curled. These runes were no worse than the ones written by Master Bentham. As long as Abel kept on practicing, he could have surpassed his master in no time. Master Bentham could not help but feel the waves of jealousy sprung up from within as he lamented on the god's bias from the inside. He had never heard of a person of Abel's age becoming a 5th-level novice knight. He had also never heard of a person who was able to forge a sword of 100 skills after only a month of training. Even the power of will he had so deeply desired was possessed by Abel. Now, when it came to writing runes, Abel had also excelled. His first attempt was already on par with those who dedicated decades of effort. Master Bentham could not take it anymore. He waved his hand at Abel and said, "Okay, you can go back to practice by yourself now." As that being said, Master Bentham took Abel out of his room. He needed time alone to lament with his injured soul. After Abel sensed that maybe Master Bentham dissatisfied, he packed up all his things and went back to his room in the castle. There was not a quiet place in the blacksmith shop for Abel to practice writing runes in peace anyway. If Abel knew what Master Bentham is thinking, he would have told him, "Oh no, you are overthinking it. I only know how to use an ink brush, and this amusing thing is a rune brush." In Abel's previous world, he had been systematically learning how to use an ink brush since the beginning of elementary school. Even after he got a job, he did not give up on this hobby. From time to time, he would take out an ink brush and wrote down a few characters to enhance his mood. After a week of training, Abel was able to completely master the 4 magical rune characters. The sizes and proportions of the strokes were perfect. However, during the process, he also realized that the fire magic rune character seemed very familiar to him. It looked very similar to the 8 #RAL rune in Diablo 2. However, there were a lot of connecting lines in this fire magic rune. Some were responsible for connecting to the hilt of the sword, and some were responsible for connecting the entire body of the sword. Overall, the structure of the rune as a whole still very similar. The purpose of the 8 rune was +5, -30 fire damage, which was also similar to this fire magic rune. Could it be that the rune of this world was related to the runes of the Dark World? Legend has it the Dark World's rune system had been long lost. To create a rune system, the only way was to use an ancient runestone to realize the power of each rune. Therefore, since the runes still existed in this world, if one had mastered more runes in the future, maybe they could also turn all the rune of Diablo 2 come into reality. But for now, it was still too early to say. Abel had only mastered 4 runes. To establish a rune system, it required the combination of the entire 33 rune characters within Diablo. As for the 4 runes Abel had mastered, after careful analysis and identification, Abel had corresponded them to the runes of Diablo 2. They were individual: the Fire Magic 8 #rune, Ice Magic 10 #rune, Electric Magic 9 #rune, and Poison Magic 7 #rune. However, there was one rune system that Abel could remember from memory. If it wasn't because this rune system was generally ranked at the top out of the many rune systems, Abel wouldn't even remember that it had even existed. The rune ability in this rune system was terrible in Diablo 2. It wasn't even as good as any ordinary low-level Dark Gold. This rune system was called the Ancient Vow. The Ancient Vow. Material required: 3 Kong Shield. Rune required: 8 +9 +7 Ability of the final product: General defense plus 50%, ice defense plus 43%. Virus defense plus 48%, fire defense plus 48%. Electricity defense plus 48%. 10% of damage could be converted to magical power. Able though it might be doable. Although its attributes were not that good in the game, it would be a powerful shield in reality. Sir Abel had decided after he had mastered all the single rune weapons, he would proceed to make this shield. The next day Abel returned to the blacksmith shop with the rune brush and the ink bottle. He found Master Bentham and said, "Master, I have mastered the 4 runes. I want to start making magic weapons today." By this point, Master Bentham had been shocked by Abel's speed of mastery way too many times. He had become completely immune to it. Even if Abel were to master the rune brush a few more days faster, he wouldn't be any more surprised. Master Bentham took out a sword of 100 skills that he had Abel forged a while ago. This was because the Knight of Marshall had stipulated long ago that Abel have the right to possess all the weapons he forged himself. Since Abel would one day inherit the castle, he should be able to use the iron as resources as well. Upon completing these swords of 100 skills, Abel would often carelessly leave them in this operation room, which was assigned by Master Bentham as Abel's private room. If an ordinary person had entered this room, they would go insane. The floor was scattered with more sword of 100 skills than all the weapons store combined in Harvest City. There were only 3 masters with the ability as high as Master Bentham, supplying their weapons to the weapon stores in Harvest. And Master Bentham could only forge 1 sword of 100 skills in a month at most. Therefore, the limitations of masters can be clearly seen. To progress from forging 80 skills to a 100 skills weapon, if one did not possess the power of will, the only way was to rely on experience and a large number of mental calculations. Masters would normally start from 80 skills, and slowly forge 1 or 2 more skills onto the weapons each day. Only a blacksmith who possessed the power of will such as Abel could forge a weapon from 80 to 100 skills in one take. However, these days, Master Bentham no longer needed to send his weapons to another weapon store to sell. This was because, in exchange for Joshua, Lord Joel had given the Knight of Marshall a weapons store, located in the most prosperous part of the Harvest City. While as for the 5 captured servants, they had also been generously sent back. That weapon shop, which was worth more than tens of thousands of gold coins, was now bringing more than 500 gold coins per month to Harry Castle. Abel removed the decorations from the sword of 100 skills handle, leaving only the metal part of the handle, hilt, and gauntlet exposed. Therefore, the gauntlet was now the only part where the magical gem could be placed. Abel placed the hilt of the sword of 100 skills into the furnace. After a while, he took the burning red sword out with a clamp. Then, took out a hammer drill and trimmed a suitable hole. When Master Bentham saw the sword, he was very pleased with Abel's proficiency in his forging foundation. One of the main reasons that Abel wanted to learn forging was to master his own power. During his spare time, he would practice different forging skills in the operation room. Each forging skill that he practiced had their very own unique powers. After all the training Abel did, he could control and maintain his skills firmly and steadily. "Master, I want to forge an ice magic sword." Due to issues with materials, Abel had to choose between fire and ice magic weapons. In his understanding of the ice magic weapons, it could slow down his opponent's speed alongside the damage caused by the ice magic. The finished product would be a devastating nightmare for anyone who encountered it. Master Bentham remained silent as he nervously watched Abel took out his runes brush. After Abel dipped it in ink, he began to write the runes onto the sword. Due to many years of using a normal ink brush, Abel's hand muscles were very well developed. Therefore, he did not find it too hard to use these soft rune brush. However, the ink used to write runes were different from the ones normally used to write on ink paper. The process of writing ice runes on the Sword of 100 Skills was a lot more difficult. With every stroke Abel wrote on the sword, he could feel waves of resistance. This was the case despite that the brush was made with wind wolf fur, which was supposed to limit the resistance force by at least half. Sweat began to flow down from Abel's head. Not only writing the runes required strength, but it also required high energy consumption from his heart. This was because the writing had to be done within one breath, and it could not be paused any time during the writing. If there was a pause, the thickness of the ink would be different, and the magic being transmitted would have gone out of Abel's control. Despite having taken half an hour, Abel's writing runes on the Sword of 100 Skill took almost 3 times longer than normal writing would. Ultimately, the deed was done. Abel took out a blue gem and carefully placed it into the hole. He reinforced the hole with different tools so that if the hole began shaking, the gem wouldn't accidentally shake or fall out. "Let me see," Master Bentham asked Abel for his Sword of 100 Skills. He carefully examined it and said, "You can write runes even faster than me. They're perfectly drawn, and the magical stone has no problem with it. I think we can proceed to the next step." Being able to see Master Bentham's affirmation of his capabilities, Abel's face began to express joy. The process of drawing these runes was difficult, and it had taken a lot of willpower out of Abel. So he sat down on the ground and rested for almost an hour before he was fully recovered his energy. Abel carefully used his willpower to draw from the blue gem to the edge of the ice magic stone according to Master Bentham's instruction. An ice-cold force rushed back at Abel as he continued to use his willpower. He then began to guide this ice-cold force carefully into the strokes of each rune. This process could not be too fast, or else the ice-cold force would be left behind, thus returning to the blue gem. However, it could also not be too slow, or else the ice-cold force would freeze his willpower. On the 5th attempt, he finally successfully used his willpower to guide the ice-cold force onto the middle of the rune. Suddenly, the Sword of 100 Skills shined with a dazzling light. Abel seemed to hear the sound of the sword blade shattering. Without a second thought, he threw his Sword of 1,000 practice outside while Master Bentham was concentrating behind the huge iron controlling desk. Suddenly, there was a loud bang sound, and all Abel heard was the sound of fragments and splinters shattering everywhere through the air. It was then followed by the sound of objects being hit with the sound of ding-ding. After a while, the sound came to complete silence and everything was suddenly quiet. Abel slowly poked his head out and glanced at the area where the explosion happened. The operations room was in complete chaos and disorder. The walls inside the room were filled with holes. Fortunately, the operation room was made of boulders and the tools inside the room were all made from fine quality iron, which meant that most of the equipment inside the rooms wasn't damaged, with the only damage being a large pit on the ground. Master Bentham recovered from the scene with a shocked face. He looked directly at Abel in the eyes, and the two individuals suddenly felt as if they were survivors of a close-call disaster. "What's the matter, Master? Are you all right?" All of a sudden, there was a loud noise coming from nowhere. Then the door of the workshop was promptly opened, and everyone in the blacksmith shop rushed and crowded inside. That bang noise that occurred has shocked and frightened everyone that was near. The room was filled with gasps and dreadful looks on people's faces, and for a moment the crowd stared astoundedly at Master Bentham and Abel. They thought to themselves what they were doing here that could have been so powerful and devastating. "All of you better keep your mouth shut. Nothing happened here, all right? Now get out of here before I make you." Master Bentham roared like a bear. He was kicking everyone out, the crowd, the gardener, even his own apprentices, everyone. Why did this happen? Abel was a little surprised by this failure because he thought he did very well this time. The process was very smooth, so why did it fail in the last moment and also caused a last-minute explosion? Master Bentham picked up the ink carefully and examined it. He carefully sniffed it with his nose and twirled it with his hand. Finally, he said firmly, "Abel, there is nothing wrong with the ink. I have produced this ink for many years now, and it was made in accordance with the same formula. There's no way it would have been like this." Then that means something went wrong in the process. Abel thought back to his own production process, and nothing was missing except that it took 3 times longer than usual to draw the runes. With that in mind, Abel said firmly, "Maybe the runes were drawn for a little too long." Yes, after a long time, the first and the last ink may be exposed to the outside environment for too long. The ink properties of the 2 periods may have changed, followed by an unstable magic transmission which may ultimately lead to the explosion. Master Bentham analyzed carefully. He had spent his entire life studying the material. When Abel was making assumptions for the reason of the explosion, he had already found out the cause for the explosion. Can you use your power of will to draw the runes? Wouldn't that be faster? Asked Master Bentham, who, as he did not possess such powers, couldn't do anything to help apart from making suggestions. Abel thought for a moment and answered, "There shouldn't be a problem. It's just that my power of will was a little bit depleted. It's going to take up a lot more time for me to rest before I can use it again." Once again, they picked up another sword of 100 skills found from the ground and punched a hole into it for the gem. This time was much faster than the first time, since Abel now acquired some experience from his first attempt. It was time to draw the runes again, and Abel closed his eyes while emptying his mind. As he slowly opened his eyes this time, he began to zoom in on the sword with his sight. Every detail on the sword was magnified multiple times larger than its original size. When the runes were drawn on the sword with ink, the 2 continued to fuse very tightly. It created a special coating, which was why the resistance was so strong when the runes were being drawn. The speed of Abel's willpower corresponded with the speed of his runes brush perfectly. There was already a night and day difference comparing this to his first attempt. The whole thing was finished in 10 minutes. Abel returned from his power of will state, and by that point, he was already fully exhausted. It took Abel 2 hours to recover from his exhaustion. Now he had gained experience of how to guide the ice-cold force with his power of will without any pauses or interruptions. Next time, he could lead the cold force into the middle of the runes at a much quicker and steadier pace. The sword of 100 skills flashed with a glaring ray of light. This time, the light was not dazzling, and the sword covered by the runes began to shine. Slowly the lights began to dim, and the rune disappeared from the surface of the sword, and the sword returned into its original appearance. In addition to the sword handle's hole slot, there were no differences between the newly crafted sword and the original sword of 100 skills. Master Bentham took the sword of 100 skills with his trembling hands and tapped it with his fingers. The sword flashed a cold light, and Master Bentham's fingers were covered with frost. Abel saw the frost on Master Bentham's finger and immediately asked, "Master, are you all right?" "Ha ha!" Master Bentham laughed wildly, tears streaming from the corners of his eyes. He began to mutter words, I never thought that I could live to see the day where one of my disciples could be making magical swords. Finally I can die without any more regrets." Abel used a few normal gems to redecorate the big sword's handguard so that no one could see the internal magical power of the gems held within the long sword. He repolished handguards, along with a curved decoration strip made, as well as adjusting the small and shattered gemstones of the sword. This transformed the sword from a normal sword of 100 skills an ultra-luxury, deluxe edition of an ice magic sword of 100 skills. The explosion that occurred on the other day had dispelled Abel's plan to create the ancient vow rune. The defense power he possessed was nowhere as strong enough to withhold its power. It would be very dangerous if it exploded again during his second try. Time flew, and in a blink of an eye, 3 months had already passed. Nowadays, Abel was living a very fulfilling lifestyle. He has already forged over 12 swords of 100 skills, one of them being the ultra-luxurious, deluxe edition of the Ice Magical Sword of 100 skills. He even produced 5 shields of 100 skills, made of rough iron. These shields were made as preparations for his future plan to make the ancient vow in the rune system. It was already April and the weather was becoming warmer and warmer. People who worked in the forgery had already begun forging weapons right from the morning. "Abel, you and I are going to the Blacksmiths' Union in Harvest City today," said Master Bentham as he looked towards Abel, who was still recovering his energy to make another one of his 100 skilled bases. "Why are we going to the Blacksmiths' Union at Harvest City, and what are we doing?" Abel questioned Master Bentham with a strange look on his face. Master Bentham replied Abel's question with an excited tone. "After you made the magic sword, I have requested a sword master from the Blacksmith Union to assess your sword. I got the news from the Blacksmiths Union yesterday, and they notified me that they will be assessing you tomorrow." "Congratulations, Master." Abel knew Master Bentham was only called the Blacksmith Master Bentham by the locals. Being able to make 100 skilled rough iron was only the fundamentals of becoming a master. In order to truly be approved by the Blacksmith Union as a blacksmith master, one would need a very diverse and profound skill set. Therefore, Master Bentham was only a competent master, but not a blacksmith master. "Why are you congratulating me? I am only the person who helped you apply." Bentham gently patted Abel's head. "For my entire life, I have been trying to forge magical weapons. I will never succeed to make one, though, and that's why I could never become a real blacksmith master. However, the fact that you can make magic weapons, it shows that you are already worthy to surpass what I'm capable of." At first, Abel doesn't seem to have a lot of interest in becoming a blacksmith master. However, when he realized that he could learn more runes if he becomes a master, as well as on the strong recommendation from Master Bentham, he agreed and said, "I will go and prepare now." Abel loaded 9 normal swords of 100 skills, and 1 luxurious, deluxe edition of the Fire Magic Sword of 100 skills onto Master Bentham's horse carriage from his private operating room. Abel decided to leave 2 of those normal swords of 100 skills at his own, Harry's weapon shop. The rest of them were being sold in Edmund's boutique shop for money. If all the swords were being sold through Harry's shop, it would hugely impact the prices of those swords in the local market, which would also lead to suspicion from other weapon shops. Ultimately, this could bring a huge disadvantage to his shop in Harvest City, which was just taken recently off the hands of Lord Joel. One of the main advantages of trading it to Edmund's boutique shop was that they have distribution shops all around the country. This meant that they could easily sell off the 7 swords. The luxury sword, on the other hand, could be auctioned off by the boutique shop, which would generate a large amount of profit for Abel. The carriage trip to Harvest City was bumpy as usual. Abel already had plans of crafting a vibration-damping carriage so that the ride won't be as bumpy. At around 10 a.m. in the morning, the horse carriage finally arrived at the Blacksmiths Union, which was located in the center of the town. The Blacksmith Union was a multinational organization in the mainland. The organization was created 3,000 years ago by a couple of humans and dwarfs, who were all blacksmith elders 3,000 years ago. After all these years, even the orcs have joined the organization. This ultimately formed the Blacksmith Union that was known today. The unions mainly assessed the blacksmith's ability and handed out medals according to the skill level. However, they also provided protection for those blacksmiths who had joined the organization. The moment Bentham and Abel entered the union's hall, a dwarf with a large beard walked towards them. This was the first time that Abel had seen a dwarf in his life. He tried his very best and controlled himself from not staring at the dwarf. "Bentham, my old friend, the union notified me to host as soon as they heard about your application." The dwarf then held his arms wide open and Bentham lowered his body to give him a hug. When they finished hugging each other, Bentham laughed and said, "I can't believe the union is telling you to host the assessment. I still remember the days where we were being taught by Mr. Robin. After so many years, you still look so young." Abel was a little speechless as he looked over at the dwarf with his face covered with his large beard. He couldn't imagine what Bentham meant when he said that his dwarf friend was young. "This is my student, Abel, and Harry. Bentham pointed at Abel, who was standing on the side, and introduced him to the dwarf. Bentham then turned around and said to Harry, "This is Master Sorin Oakshield Jr., who studied with me." Sorin Oakshield jumped in and yelled, "I am your senior, mind you. Back when we studied together when I was a young adult, you were still a child. So, of course, I am your senior." Bentham laughed. "Oh, I'm older than you, yet I was still a child," Master Sorin yelled as he waved his fists around. Abel finally understood the argument between the two of them as he watched from the side. Dwarfs generally had a longer lifespan, usually about 500 years. But normal humans could only live for around 100 years, so that's why they were having this banter with one another. Master Sorin knew that there wouldn't be a point to continue to dwell on this topic, so he quickly turned his head and began talking about Abel. "So is this the person that will be assessed to become the new blacksmith master? He is way too young. You only have one chance in your lifetime to apply for an assessment to become a blacksmith master, and you gave it to him." These questions clearly showed that Sorin did not trust Abel's ability. Every skill that a blacksmith acquired needed time to perfect and master. "I am almost 60 years old, and I am losing my essence. I am afraid that I cannot become a blacksmith master anymore. I would never have the chance to use this application." But Master Bentham looked directly towards Abel and said, "Ever since Abel became a student of mine, he had created miracles again and again. I believe that he has the ability to become a master blacksmith, and that's why I brought him here for an assessment." "Okay, up to you, then. Let us begin the assessment." Master Sorin led both of them into the workshop. There were 3 mirrors placed on the wall, there was a blacksmith workbench in the middle with all the tools that they need, and there was also a blacksmith furnace on the side that was burning. Sorin then took out 6 red gems and placed them on the notch of the wall. All of a sudden, the mirror's surface began to shake. 3 figures, including a dwarf and 2 humans, began to emerge. Master Bentham then proceeded to bow to the 3 figures in the mirror. "Hello, masters. Sorry for interrupting your time." Abel seemed to be quite amazed and shocked at the same time. Then, Master Sorin began to explain the procedures of the assessment to him. Master blacksmiths had 5 chances to apply for a headmaster assignment. A top-tier blacksmith was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. After the application was passed, there would be a Grand Master here to be the witness, and the other 3 will be remotely assessing the processes of the procedures through a magical array. This type of magic array was made by the Array Master of the Elves. It could only transfer images, but it cannot transfer sound. "Let's start," Master Sorin said to Abel after explaining the rules and procedures. Abel remained silent. He first bowed to Master Sorin and the 3 masters on the mirrors. The raw materials on the workbench were very high quality. Abel took a piece of the material and threw it into the furnace. After a short period of time, he took out the material and hammered it back and forth. Due to his highly trained proficient skill and speed, it only took a little over 2 hours to forge the material to the 80 skills. Now he only needed to further forge him from 80 skills to 100 skills. Since he was using up his power of will, the speed of him forging the material from 80 to 100 was even faster than before. Master Sorin began to look at Abel in a new light. The skillful use of his power of will when it comes to forging was not very common among the masters. Instead, most masters would use their experience to forge the martial from 80 skills to 100 skills. It didn't take long for the materials to be forged to 100 skills. After taking a small break, Abel began to shape the sword. The time flew past quickly, and the sword has taken its shape. Abel did not stop there. He proceeded to use the chisel to open a small indent on the handguard. This move suddenly grabbed Master Sorin's attention. He immediately turned to Master Bentham with a look of doubt. But Master Bentham nodded back to Sorin confidently, confirming his belief in his student. Master Sorin knew that although Bentham had been trying to forge a sword like this for his entire life, Bentham had failed. However, now it seemed that his student was able to complete his cherished desire. The moment Abel took out his ruined pen, Master Sorens confirmed his suspicions. Magical weapons were some of the highest tier weapons. It was considered precious even from the master tier weapon perspective. Seeing that Abel was in a state of deep focus as he drew the runes, the three masters in the mirror immediately knew what weapon it would be. Therefore, they began to pay even closer attention. The final process of embedding the blue gem and the guidance of the power of will went smoothly. Soon, a nice magical sword was completed. Although it was not decorated, the masters agreed this ice magical sword was fabulous, and it had well surpassed the blacksmith master examination standards. Master Soren turned around and looked at the three figures in the mirror. After all the masters nodded in confirmation, Master Soren took out a medal from his chest directly and spoke to Abel with a serious tone. "Congratulations, Abel Harry Master, you are now the 36th blacksmith master in the Blacksmith Union." After these words, Master Soren placed the medal in front of Abel's chest. He then stepped up and gave Abel a hug. Just like Master Bentham, Abel also bent down to return Master Soren's hug. This gesture of kindness showed that Master Soren was now treating Abel as an equal. The three masters from the mirror have also bowed at Abel. As soon as Abel finished returning the bow, the figures vanished from the mirror. Because Master Bentham and the Knight of Marshall had businesses to discuss together, the Knight of Marshall had arranged it so that he would come to the council to pick up them up back to the castle after 2 hours. In the meantime, Abel sat on his carriage and went off towards Edmund's boutique shop. When Abel entered Edmund's boutique shop, Yvette was nowhere near in sight, so Abel went towards the counter and asked the male assistant, "I'm looking for Miss Yvette, have you seen her?" Since Master Bentham had just dropped off Abel in Harvest City directly coming from the blacksmith shop, Abel was still wearing grey cotton overalls. It was stained with traces of burnt fabric and sparks from the master blacksmith examination. Alongside with Abel's young age, he looked as if he was just another normal civilian. Surprisingly, the male shop assistant did not discriminate against Abel since he saw that Abel had arrived on a horse carriage. No matter how Abel looked or who he may be, the shop assistant knew that anyone who arrives on a horse carriage was probably someone who he couldn't afford to offend. Else he could risk losing his job. Therefore, the shop assistant politely assisted Abel to wait at the chairs in the reception hall. Before the waiter left, he gave Abel a cup of coffee, then promptly went upstairs to find Yvette. Suddenly, a shrill voice came out from somewhere. "Who do you think you are? How could a peasant like you sit down at a boutique shop? Are you here for the free coffee, is that it?" Abel looked around hesitantly for a few moments before finding out that it was himself who was being called a peasant. Abel had already accustomed to his identity in this world. Ever since he came here, no one has ever made such an insult to him. He looked at the man with a frown on his face and spoke to the man directly. The man who called Abel a peasant was a skinny 30-years-old man with a face as dry as the desert. He was wearing a black dress like a stick in his body with a posture like a bent shrimp. "Are you talking about me?" Abel questioned the man in an unimpressed and dissatisfied tone. "Nice try in pretending to be someone you'll never be." The man then glanced over towards Abel. He then laughed at Abel as he saw the blacksmith medal that he, not even once, had seen in his whole life. "If you're going to bring a blacksmith medal, at least bring one that looks real, not some shady fake pieces like these." "Guards, get this guy out of here," the man said with a mocking tone. "Sir, please exit the store," said the two guards as they approached Abel. "If Edmund's boutique shop doesn't give me what I'm looking for, I will forward this matter to the noble tribunal for my rights and authority to be here," said Abel as he took out the white unicorn coat of arms from one of the pockets. He immediately displayed it in front of the guards. When the two guards saw the coat of arms from Abel's hand, they frantically ran away in panic. The man who doubted Abel suddenly became pale and shocked. No one in this world dared to fake the coat of arms. This was because that faking the coat of arms was a sin and it would often lead to a death penalty. Moreover, the coat of arms represented the status of a noble. Only the noble and his successors would have had the rights and eligibility to use the family coat of arms. The noble arbitration court was built to protect the noble's rights. When the noble's dignity was violated, the noble arbitration court would step in and defend the noble's legitimate rights. This may sound a civilized thing to do, but the noble arbitration court and a course of action were extremely cruel. According to past events, every time a noble arbitral tribunal was dispatched for violating and insulting the dignity of these high-class nobles, someone was bound to be burned to death. "What's the matter?" Yvette hurried down the stairs at a brisk pace and saw the situation and what was happening. When two guards saw her, they slowly walked back with the body shrinking backward. Yvette quickly glanced over and saw Abel's clothes. She quickly realized the situation and she spoke apologetically. "Hello, I apologize on behalf of Edmund's auction house for all the inconvenience caused to you." At the same moment, Yvette's eyes froze as she witnessed the medal on Abel's chest. "Are you a master, Abel? The 36th blacksmith to pass the blacksmith master rating," said Yvette with an astonished and shocked tone. "Miss Yvette, you were correct, I am Abel. I didn't realize that the news would go around so fast." Abel lamented on how fast the news has spread. Rumors were just as widespread as it was on Earth. "Master Abel, we have just received word from headquarters that you have passed the assessment at the Harvest City Blacksmith Guild. Headquarters has specifically requested that our division follow closely onto you." Yvette then quickly glanced over to the man who doubted Abe, and followed up with an apology. "Abel, our boutique shop will give you an account of your injustice." When the tall and thin man heard what Yvette had said, he suddenly became paralyzed on the ground. These words from Yvette had sealed his fate. But at the same time, he knew how insignificant his fate is in the eyes of others. Abel had a special intention when he wore his blacksmith master medal to Edmund's boutique shop. This was because he wanted to auction his sword of 1,000 skills, and also a deluxe version of a fire magical sword of 100 skills at Edmund's boutique shop in this identity. By doing so, not only it was easier to sell the swords, but it could also attract more publicity to this auction, therefore maximizing the value of these weapons. "Miss Yvette, I've brought some of the forged weapons that I've made, and I'd like Edmund's boutique shop to help me put it up for auction." When Yvette heard what Abel had said, her eyes lit up and suddenly shined. This was a wonderful opportunity for her to be putting up the newly titled Master Blacksmith's weapons for sale at Edmund's auction house. As Yvette was in charge of this matter, this could well be an immense achievement for her, and it would boost her future career and promotion tremendously. "Thank you for your trust in Edmund's boutique shop, and we will sell your work at the highest standards within our auction," said Yvette excitedly. Abel made a proposition. On one condition only: these weapons will not be auctioned at Harvest City. At first, Yvette was confused by Abel's proposition, but then she immediately understood his reasonings. This was because there was a new weapon shop called Harry's Weapon Shop in the same town, and Abel's last name was Harry as well. Therefore Abel must not want people to misunderstood that all the weapons in that store were also owned by his family. "No problem, Master Abel." To Yvette, it didn't matter where she sold the weapons, as long as she was in charge of the selling, she would have been able to take all the credits regardlessly. As the guards unloaded some of the weapons from Abel's carriage at the front door, Abel pointed to the 7 swords of 1,000 skills and said, "These are just the weapons I made during my training, they're just ordinary weapons of 100 skills. He then pointed towards the deluxe version of Fire Magical Sword and said, "This variant was made with the use of dwarf technology. After some decorations, I named it the deluxe version of Fire Magic Sword of 1,000 skills." "Wait, is this a magical weapon?" Of course, Yvette had heard of magical weapons before. That being said, though, they were classified as extremely rare and high-end weapons. Even the headquarters of the Edmund boutique store could rarely see one. Curiously, Yvette drew the large sword from its sheath, but the sword was too heavy for a lady. So she held the large sword with both her hands and attempted to place it on the counter for a closer inspection. Suddenly Abel's heart skipped a beat as he what Yvette was about to do. He quickly shouted, "Be careful." But it was too late. The fire magical sword had slipped from Yvette's hand. The moment that the body of the sword touched the floor, a red light flashed from the body of the sword. Dong! The sword had hit the ground. In that split second, the area where the sword was dropped had become fully blackened, and the atmosphere of the boutique shop was filled with a burnt smell. Abel quickly picked up the sword from the ground and placed it back into the sheath. Yvette was in complete shock and frightened by what had just happened. The sword would have put a huge hole on the counter if it was directly placed there. Let alone thinking of the consequences burning down such an expensive counter, Yvette could not help but pat herself on the chest. At the same time, she had now truly experienced how terrifying the fire magical power of this sword was. She couldn't imagine what would be the consequence if this sword was used to attack people. "Master Abel, I will only charge a commission of 2% of the total value of your weapons." This was the lowest commission that Yvette could have offered to anyone. And she offered it Abel for thanking him earlier for his warning. "Thank you, Ms. Yvette." Abel had understood all the details and procedures of the auction, and thankful for Yvette's kind intentions. Then, Yvette signed the contract with Abel. Therefore, the 7 swords of 100 skills and the deluxe version of a fire magic sword of 100 skills were left at Edmund's boutique shop for auction. Afterward, Abel went to Harry's weapons shop and handed 2 more swords of 100 skill to the manager. The manager did not ask any questions as he was an experienced businessman. Seeing that the 2 hours were already up, Abel called the driver and headed back to the blacksmith shop to pick up Master Bentham and go back to the castle. 30 minutes had passed. The two were well on their way now, going back to the castle. During the journey, Abel and Master Bentham were exchanging knowledge in their forging experiences with one another. But for most parts, Master Bentham was mainly teaching and mentoring Abel. Although Abel was a quick learner and had already become a blacksmith master, he was nowhere near as experienced as Master Bentham. While they were chatting away, Abel suddenly felt that the carriage had come to a stop. So, he then lifted the curtain of the horse carriage and asked the driver, "What's wrong?" The cart driver was in shock as he spoke with a sense of astonishment. "Something seems odd with the village ahead. Maybe something had happened." Abel then spoke directly to Master Bentham. "Master, you stay in the carriage while I go take a look at what's going on." Master Bentham laughed and said, "I'm a level 5 fighter myself. You don't need to worry about me." For someone who was only a level 5 fighter like Master Bentham, Abel was extremely skeptical about his capacity to fight. Even the Knight of Martial himself had to keep training every single day to maintain his fighting ability. As for Master Bentham, Abel had never seen him practicing his fighting skills a single time ever since the day they met. But Abel did not insist on Master Bentham staying. As the two got out of the carriage, they immediately saw the distant village rising in clouds of black smoke. "I'll go ahead and take a look." As Abel pulled out the great ice magical sword that had been forged during the blacksmith union evaluation from the trunk of the carriage. The sword was not yet decorated, so it looked ugly, but it certainly would not affect its defensive capabilities and functions. "Be careful," Master Bentham warned. Abel waved his hand, signaling that he understood Bentham's goodwill, and promptly walked towards the village. The closer he got to the village, the more Abel sensed that something was wrong. It wasn't just a small fire, it was the entire village and its houses being burned down. When Abel arrived at the village, he was in shock from what he had just witnessed. The ground of the village was littered with dead bodies of the innocent villagers. Not only that, but some of the dead bodies were mutilated. It seemed as though they had been bitten by an animal of some sort. The most disturbing thing to Abel was the sight of the multiple corpses of children. These bodies were scattered in almost all parts of the village. It was obvious that what happened here was an unjust slaughter. Only a group that had absolute power could have planned a massacre like this. In Abel's knowledge of this world's history, it would be extremely rare to see the slaughtering of innocent civilians, even if it's an invasion of another country. As Abel walked around the village, there was not a single survivor. It seemed that the killers were highly trained and experienced. They might even possess special abilities. The places where the people hid had been completely abolished, and those who had hidden were killed without mercy. Abel had never felt such anxious, it was almost indescribable to him. Even though this area was not a part of his family's territory. As a human being, he couldn't help but felt a sense of sympathetic sadness and sorrowfulness for the victims of this massacre. When Abel came to this world, he thought he saw a peaceful image. Even though he had been attacked by people before. He thought that no world could be perfect, there would always be criminals out there. However, what he had witnessed today was the first time something has shocked him to his soul. Maybe this world was not as peaceful as he had imagined. People were being slaughtered in their own home. What would have happened if that was his own family? What if it was the Bennett family? As Abel didn't return for a long period of time, Bentham was starting to get worried. He quickly hurried to the village. When he saw the scene of the massacre and the bodies, he was also in a great deal of shock. God, what happened? Master Bentham quickly went over to the bodies of the victims and examined it carefully. Orcs, he said grimly, it was the orcs. Master Bentham then pointed towards the wounds of the corpses and said, these were the bite marks of wolves. No wonder there were recent reports of wolf riders being seen around here. The wolf riders were the dominant unit of the Orc Empire's military, which were mostly trained by the werewolves and worgens. The wolf rider troops were extremely strong when it came to the speed, agility, flexibility, and the stance of direction. All these characteristics made the wolf cavalry one of the strongest armies here in mainland. Not only were they strong, but they were also extremely adaptable to even the toughest environment. During long battles, they feed off from the slain enemies, allowing them for maximum efficiencies in continuing the battles. We better go back immediately. The Knight of Marshall needs to know about this. Suddenly, something occurred to Master Bentham. He realized that there must be still some werewolves nearby, and with the speed of these werewolves, all the villages and castles nearby around here would be in great danger. Abel and Master Bentham quickly returned to the carriage and hurried back towards Harry's castle, with the driver driving as fast as he can. Simon was a worgen, or rather a wolf rider in the wolf cavalry. His wife was a female wolf named Black Wind. Simon's home was in a barren plain that had experienced a great deal of poverty. His home had around 200 acres of land, and he had 9 brothers and sisters. As Simon was the second child of the family, the 200 acres of land not providing enough source of food for their entire family's need. So, his parents decided to use up the majority of their resources on Simon, as he had the potential of becoming a member of the Wolf Riders. But by doing so, this meant that all his brothers and sisters would starve. In order to gain more land for his family, Simon made up his mind. He would participate in the trial of death. In the past, every participant who could survive the trial of death would be rewarded with a piece of land. Besides that, most of them could often be brought back a large number of gold coins and gems, which were more than enough to buy a whole lot of land. Simon tried his best, not thinking about the consequences of the annual trial death. He tried not to remind himself of a large number of people who would not make it back alive. He only wished to be one of the survivors. Simon felt that he was out of luck the other night when he was passing through the Budapest mountains. He allocated his wife Black Wind to rest a shed within the barracks. There were a lot of other male wolves in the shed. One of them had sexual interaction with his wife. After riding the flying beast through the Budapest mountains, the small group of cavalry troops, which consisted of 10 members, set off and began the journey. Everything was going smoothly as they progressed forward. They avoided towns and only attacked small villages, although the rewards from raiding these small villages weren't massive. These successive raids on the small villages allowed Simon to gain a significant amount of confidence throughout his journey. But one day, Simon found out that his wife was pregnant. Wolves were extremely loyal creatures. Their loyalty to their master was unprecedented among all animals. When a baby wolf was born, the first creature it sees would ultimately become its master. Normally, the pregnancy of a wolf was a very happy event and deserved to be celebrated. Whether if it was to give his brother the right to claim his title as the master, or to give up the privilege of being a master in exchange for a large number of resources. It was just a beautiful thing within the wolves' culture. But since this was a world where humans lived, Simon would have to fight here with the current situation on hand. A pregnant wolf meant that it would greatly affect Simon's ability to use his power during the trial. Even though the villagers in the previous siege did not resist their attack by the gore and excessive violence of their attacks, it gave Black Wind a lot of damage during her pregnancy. This meant that she was unable to keep up with the squad, and the other wolf cavalry team members weren't willing to put themselves at risk for Simon's problems. The only reason that the wolves were able to launch multiple attacks in different villages was because of the speed. The speed of the wolf cavalry determined the fate during the trial of death. Simon stayed behind while the others left. He was the only one that stayed with his wife. He didn't dare to enter toward the open. The only thing he could have done was to hide in the forest and wait for Black Wind to give birth. Every day Simon was hunting in the jungle, and every time he went out and hunt, there was just enough food for him and his partner to eat and survive. He often thought to himself, when would he be able to own land like these, to have more food than he could ever eat? The wealth of humans in this world often attracted countless orcs like Simon himself. They all have one common goal: grab it and occupy it. Every day, Simon carved a line on a tree to count off the days. All he wanted now was to spend his remaining 2 months safely in this jungle. Then, he could travel back to Meetup Zone to return home to his orc empire. Uncle Marshall, when I was on my way back from Harvest City, I witnessed a village that was attacked by the orcs. It was located between the castle and Harvest City. When Knight Marshall heard about this affair, he immediately notified his steward Lindsay. Ring the alarm bell now and get all the villagers from all of our territories to enter the castle for shelter now. When they are inside, make sure you verify their identity as well. Yes, my lord, Lindsay quickly said and promptly hurried out. Uncle Marshall, I've prepared a present for you. I originally intended to give this present to you later for your birthday. But with the current circumstances we have on our hands, I think you should have it now so that it could increase your strength. Abel then brought out a deluxe version of an ice magic sword of 100 skills directly from his bag. When they returned to the castle, Abel went into the operations room and took out another piece of the deluxe ice magic sword of 100 skills, which was also originally prepared for Marshall's birthday. However, he decided to give the deluxe version of the ice magic sword of 100 skills directly to Knight Marshall right now. This was a crucial move for Abel, since increasing their fighting strength was what mattered the most right now. Once again, Abel took out another piece of the deluxe version of the ice magic sword of 100 skills. There wasn't much time left to lose, so Abel also handed it over into the hands of Knight Marshall. A magic sword. The Knight Marshall pulled out the sword as he gently touched the sword with his fingers. He then hastily shook off the frost on his hand and said excitedly, "Wow, this is a magic ice sword. That's the good stuff. He then turned around and looked undeviatingly at Abel and stated, "Bentham had been researching the forging process of magic weapons for a long time. Looks like his hard work has finally paid off. This was my gift to you. How could you say that it was forged from Master Bentham?" Abel felt a sense of speechlessness to see that the gift that he made was being said to be made by someone else's. Knight Marshall couldn't believe it. He was speechless for a while. "Abel, you made this sword?" Knight Marshall questioned him with a sense of disbelief. Abel remained in silence. He then pointed directly to his own master blacksmith's medal on his chest. It was then that Knight Marshall has finally just realized that Abel had an extra medal carried on him. "You're a master blacksmith," after hearing what Abel said. Knight Marshall was suddenly in doubt of the entire world and his whole existence. Since when could a 13-year-old novice like you can become a master blacksmith? "The trip that I took to Harvest City was for evaluating the weapons I've made," Abel said. Was this true? Knight Marshall's facial expression immediately shifted from being astonished to being wildly excited. He then began to laugh frantically and joy. "Ha ha ha ha, BWAHAHA. We have a master blacksmith here in our own home. Hey Abel, I want the best magic armor, the strongest magic shield, a magic knight firearm. Oh, I almost forgot, I also want a magical bow too." Abel looked at the already overly enthusiastic Knight Marshall. He headed out of the room without even bothering to look back. According to what Knight Marshall had requested, it would have required all the best blacksmiths in the Blacksmith Union. All for a silly dream such as this. All of a sudden, the bell rang heavily. There were 20 soldiers wearing leather armors and equipped with long guns. They rode their horses as they gathered in front of the castle. The Knight Marshall immediately changed into his imitation blazing sun armor as he jumped onto his personal white war horse. His horse was way more powerful than any other ordinary war horses. It was tall and equipped with a deluxe edition of the Sword of 100 Skills, Abel's gift. On his hand, he was carrying a knight's rifle as he stood in front of his squad of cavalry soldiers preparing to give a speech. Those filthy orcs had appeared again. "My soldiers, let's get our weapons ready. Together we will defend our homeland from these orcs." After hearing Knight Marshall's motivating address, the soldiers were all aroused and were all ready to go into battle to fight bravely. If anyone managed to slay an orc himself, it would be considered an outstanding military service. In the past, the only way to achieve an outstanding military service was to serve as a guard in Miracle City. Now, this opportunity was everywhere. Abel, he thought the soldiers at Harry's castle were brave and steadfast. An entire platoon of 20 horses. Along with the costs of training for these soldiers, only the wealthy and powerful people like Bentham's masters could have afforded such a group of well-trained elite soldiers. At the Bennet castle, a sweaty messenger quickly approached the Knight Bennet and handed him a parcel. He quickly told the butler to give a small reward to compensate the messenger as he returned immediately back to his room with the parcel. When the Knight Bennet opened the package, he spotted a large sword and 2 enclosed letters. One of the letters was from Knight Marshall, informing him about the recent attacks that occurred on the villages, as well as to raise their awareness and to scout out for any future orc attacks that may occur. The other letter was from Abel, which read, "Your birthday present came early." When Knight Bennet pulled out a large sword from his package, he immediately recognized that something was different about this sword. The value of the sword he had just pulled out was immeasurable. When he found out that the sword was an ice magical sword, the Knight of Bennet immediately felt a heart full of sentiment. Even though Abel had become the adopted son of someone else, Abel was still willing to spend a large amount to purchase an ice magical sword as a present for the Knight of Bennet to protect himself after he realized the orcs were now roaming around. These days, the Knight Bennet was already filled with regrets for letting Abel get adopted. If he had realized that Abel had forged this sword himself, who knows how much more regretful could he get. When Abel traveled to the blacksmith store earlier today, everyone who saw him, including his apprentices, was all gazing at him differently. They all seemed to obtain a sense of respect for Abel. People were now addressing him as Master Abel, but he seemed to be stressed whenever he heard people calling him by the title of Master. However, Abel was no longer an undistinguished ordinary blacksmith. He was now a blacksmith master, which required him to be less humble and modest about his identity, as he was now representing an entire community, the highest of the blacksmith union. When Abel went back into the store, he went into his dedicated operations room and locked himself inside. Ever since he started forging weapons, he always had a low requirement for his equipment. Although he could forge a sword of 100 skills, he had never truly forged a customized weapon for himself. The only sword that he had with him was the magic ice sword, which was forged during the blacksmith examination. Why didn't Abel forge weapons for himself? First, Abel himself was not in any particular danger back then. He had never thought that it would be in use and it would be wasteful to leave it there to rust. Secondly, his body was growing speedily due to puberty. This meant that the equipment that he made now would be wasted, as the equipment that he crafted would not be able to fit him as he grew even 1 year older. However, in the current situation, the chances of a battle happening were extremely likely. So Abel finally decided to forge a few pieces of protective gear just in case. By doing so, the new equipment would greatly enhance Abel's chance of remaining alive. The upcoming battle looked as though it would determine the life and death of Abel and everyone he knew. First, Abel had to experiment a little bit with his current concept. He then wore some very thick gloves and placed a ceramic bottle into the furnace. After it was burning for a while, he took out the ceramic bottle with iron clamps, then directly threw a bucket of iced water at it. Almost at the same time, Abel stuffed the ceramic bottle in the Heredric cube and pressed start. Although Abel saw that the ceramic bottle had entered inside the Heredric cube, there was not a change ever since Abel took it out of the furnace. After remaining silent in deep thought, suddenly Abel realized that the body of the ceramic bottle seemed to have some cracks in them. As soon as Abel moved a single heartbeat, the ceramic bottle appeared on his hands. At the same time, he slammed the ceramic bottle into a pile of debris, and as it fell to the ground, everything was shattered to pieces. It worked. Abel rejoiced and immediately felt a sense of relief and satisfaction in his heart. Now Abel had to forge a piece of a large magic sword. The current pace he had right now was considered very quick already. Normally it would take around 5 hours on average to forge a magic sword. He was fast enough now to take 5 hours to make a big magic sword. With the magic sword now in the process of being forged, Abel intentionally wanted to write a few runes differently. He added a lot of useless strokes connecting in the most complicated way. During the final step, when he was leading the magical power of the blue gem to the center of the runes, the moment before the white light flashed, he shoved the sword into the Heredric cube. With the leftover time, Abel worked extremely hard to create an oversized shield of 100 skills. The shield was as thick as 30 centimeters. If Abel wasn't a level 5 knight, he wouldn't even be able to lift this gigantic shield. Abel then took the failed magic ice sword that he just made from the Heredric cube. This time Abel had learned his lesson. The moment he took out the sword, he threw it outside and he counted slowly, 1, 2, 3 in his head. When Abel counted to 3, he heard a loud bang outside the shield, followed by a chaotic noise of ding ding dong dong. It sounded like the shield being struck by 1,000 spears. After the noise had stopped, Abel peeked his head from the back of the shield. The explosion was much larger this time. The large stone wall was pierced with countless scattered pieces, some even seemed to have made a small hole on the wall. When Abel saw his shield, he was so deeply shocked that his entire body felt like they were drenched in cold sweat. There were holes everywhere on his shield, and the holes looked as if they were hit by bullets. It was even deep enough to put a finger through. If Abel wasn't holding an extra thick shield, he might have been heavily wounded from the blast of the sword. Abel couldn't believe that by adding a few runes circuits, the effect of the explosion would have increased by such a significant amount. What would have happened if a sword like this were thrown in the middle of a crowd? Abel thought to himself. Abel could only imagine the catastrophic accidents it would have caused. No one could have survived a blast that strong. Of course, such a highly dangerous weapon had to be stored in the Heredric cube, so a weapon like this could only be Abel's secret weapon. The Heredric cube was the most important secret of Abel. His success was entirely aided with the assistance. Therefore, Abel would not let anyone who had a glimpse of it remain alive. In the evening, Abel did not return to the castle to rest. He stayed up the entire night to forge 3 pieces of exploding swords to be stored within the Heredric cube. In the meantime, Abel had also learned self-defense and how to properly protect himself. Abel suddenly thought about the grenades in the original old world. The explosion that had just occurred was similar to the explosion of grenades. According to what Abel learned from the era of the explosion, the safest place to survive after a grenade exploded would be on the ground, even though there would be shockwaves. Based on the original world's concept of the tank cannon bounce shells, Abel built a much smaller shield that could be hung around the waist. During the explosion, the person could reduce the number of damage in an explosion by lying on the ground, and then using the small shield to bounce off the pieces of debris at different oblique angles. Abel returned to the castle the next morning. After he had breakfast and rested for 2 hours, he returned to his private operation room in the Blacksmith's Guild. For the trillionth time, Abel was a bodybuilding trainer in his previous life. He was used to going hiking with his friends in the wild, which made him have a lot of experience in hunting. This time, Abel wanted to make a giant bear trap according to his memories. As Master Bentham suggested, the Wolf Riders were very fast and flexible. They would often implement a hit-and-run strategy during battle. If they didn't have a large number of soldiers to surround them, it would be very difficult to annihilate them. However, things would be completely different if we could make a large bear trap. If a Wolf Rider stepped on it, it would at the very least injure their leg. This could hugely reduce the speed, therefore they will no longer be a threat. The beasts and humans of this world were both much stronger than the beasts and humans in the previous incarnation of Earth. Thus, Abel thought that he needed something special to stop these Wolf Riders. The components of the gigantic bear trap consisted of a large compression spring, 2 charm clamps, a clamp trigger, a button, and a chain. After the compression spring was flattened with force, it was gently held secured with the clamp trigger. If someone stepped on it, the 2 sharp clamps would be released instantaneously, catching the prey with a tremendous amount of rebound force. Since the 2 sharp clamps were not fully enclosed yet, the more the prey struggled, the tighter the grip would be. It would be easy to imagine if the man-wolf or the Wolf Rider was caught by this gigantic bear trap. With the speed of the Wolf Rider, the man-wolf would be in excruciating amounts of pain. Therefore, the Wolf Rider would most likely be shaken off by the man-wolf. This world did not have such a large bear trap, therefore the placement of the traps should not attract too much attention to the orcs, especially if we add some more camouflage to it. The process of making the trap was simple. The only trouble was the compression spring. According to Abel's memory, the steel used in the spring must require a high carbon content to maintain the steel's elasticity. Abel practiced by forging a rough model with 100 skills. After several attempts of carburizing, a lot of small samples were made according to different carburizing ratios. After testing, he decided on the best sample, and the production process was finally determined. Then, Abel began mass production. After he made 10 compression springs, there was still a lot of materials left. He then made several large spiral springs which could be used as shock absorbers when he decided to upgrade the carriage in the future. Abel did not make any other accessories of the gigantic bear trap since that would take too much time. The compression springs were the component that mattered the most. The other parts could let other blacksmiths in the blacksmith shop take care of it. Abel called his senior, Gordon, who gave him a drawn blueprint and dimensions of the bear trap's other components, and requested it to be forged in 2 days. Gordon did not have a problem with the request since he ordered a few of the most capable blacksmiths to work extra hours to complete it as soon as possible. Early next morning, when Abel arrived at the blacksmith shop, Gordon told Abel with a pair of tired red eyes, "Master Abel, all the parts are made according to your requirements. And they're placed in your operation room." Abel was very surprised. He thought that it would have taken at least 2 days, but it was finished in one night. Looking at the tired red eyes of Gordon, he could not help but say, "Why didn't you sleep last night? I don't need these parts in a rush." Since the blacksmiths heard that it was your command, they refused to delay it and worked overnight. Gordon did not mention himself. He only gave the credit to the other blacksmiths, who was standing in front of Abel. "Next time, when I forge a sword of 100 skill, the blacksmiths and you can watch on the side. Now, go to rest," Abel said with a smile. "Thank you, Master Abel, I will let him know." Gordon thanked Abel and ran off. When Abel walked into the operation room, he saw a pile of accessories placed on the ground. It has been divided into 10 parts. For these details alone, it was enough to show that Gordon was a very attentive person. It took some effort to assemble such large bear traps, but Abel had always been a tough person. In half an hour, 10 large traps were fully assembled. 2 horses were brought in, and each of them was strapped with 5 large traps. After it was secured, Abel waved a hand, signaling that they were ready to go. Behind Harry Castle was a forest. Since Abel has been busy ever since he settled here, he never had the chance to explore this forest. He has heard that there were large beasts roaming around in there, therefore Abel decided this would be the place to test out his giant bear trap. Although the castle has now begun to be on guard, when Abel left the castle with the 2 horses, no guard dared to ask anything. Abel's current status was completely different from that when he first arrived. Everyone knew that Abel has now become a blacksmith's master. In this world, the title of master could be attained by the elites of that particular profession. Therefore, they would be respected no matter where they go in the Holy Continent. It was the sunniest part of the afternoon. The sun was shining through the gaps of the trees, scattering patches of lights over the fallen leaves on the ground. It made a dull crunching sound as Abel continued to walk. The horses were not very fond of the forest environment either, as their nose began to make snorting sounds. After he walked for about half an hour, Abel felt that he had arrived at the center of the forest. Although he did not see a single large beast along the way, he found a large pile of beast dung, which suggested there must be large beasts around here. The place was deserted. The last sign of civilization had already disappeared 10 minutes ago. Abel immediately knew this was the perfect place to put a bear trap since the trap was so powerful it could not be placed anywhere close to humans. Abel squatted down to look for a beast's route on the ground. Beasts would always like to travel on the same route, and they would often leave some footprints behind. Therefore, experienced hunters would always know where the best place to set the traps. Although Abel didn't have as much experience, he was still trained in this aspect. So after careful observation, he found a beast's route. He immediately took out 2 gigantic bear traps from the horses. Then, he opened the clamps by force and secured the trigger. There were many techniques when it came to the placements of bear traps. You had to inspect the beast's route properly in order to speculate the steps they would take. Even if the beast could dodge the first bear trap, it would not be able to escape the second one. After the installation, Abel made an arrow marking on a tree. This mark was a reminder of where Abel had placed the trap and would make sure he wouldn't step in it himself. However, since there were arrows on the marking pointing towards different directions, it also allowed Abel to less likely get lost in the forest. Abel continued to move forward. Every 10 minutes, he would find a place to put a bear trap. Slowly, he walked for more than an hour, and all the large traps were placed. The sky began to get dark. Abel was packing up his things, preparing to go back to the castle. There were still 2 hours before the sky was completely darkened. Until then, he could still see his way back. At that moment, suddenly he heard a painful yet angry scream from the distance. A beast must have fallen for his gigantic bear trap. Only a beast could have made a noise in this forest. Abel strapped his horse next to a tree and rushed in the direction of the sound. As Abel was running, he was constantly observing the surrounding environment and the marking he made. It would be hilarious if he had fell for his own trap. After running for 10 minutes, Abel found the marking that he made. He slowed down and walked gently into the trap. Although the sharp clamps had been triggered, there was no prey to be found anywhere. Abel squatted down and touched sharp teeth of the clamp with his hands. There was blood. What triggered the trap might not be a beast after all. Although Abel doesn't know what else could have triggered it, a beast definitely would not have the intelligence to free itself from it, especially without the help of a human hand. If the beast was very powerful, at most, it would just destroy the trap, not leaving it enclosed like this. Could it be human? Abel shook his head. The voice he had just heard was clearly not human. That he could be certain of. Not far from where the gigantic bear trap was placed, Abel spotted even more bloodstains on the ground. As he resumed his search following the directions of the blood trails, he suddenly stumbled across another spot of bloodstains which wasn't too far from the original directions that he had come from. Abel continued to follow the blood trail. From the looks of it, the prey didn't seem to be injured badly. It was probably just a leg. However, as he continued, he thought that maybe the wound on the prey's leg might be quite serious since it bled continuously. Abel's hunting instinct and experience in his previous life had taught him that when prey was injured, they instinctively sought the most secure and safe place for themselves to recover from the injury. This would probably be the case with this prey as well. After following the blood trail for around 30 minutes, Abel suddenly saw lights from a fire in front of him. Abel felt confused and found it strange. Humans would never have survived or habited in a place like this. As he slowly approached the fire, Abel saw in the distance a creature that he had never seen before treating its own leg wounds. A creature had a head that looked like a wolf, 2 canine teeth protruding from the outside, alongside with a body that resembled a human. However, it had a slightly more curved back with a height of around a little over 2 meters. Next to the creature was a huge mysterious wolf resting on the ground. The belly of the wolf seemed to be so large that it looked as if it was pregnant. Abel was now certain that the creature in front of him was the wolf troopers that attacked the village that he saw earlier, and the wolf that was resting near it must be the legendary Mount Wolf. Once again, Simon was out of luck. He hid in the jungle, away from the humans. Every day, he hunted for food to keep himself and the Mount Wolf well fed. One day, he went out to hunt just like any other ordinary days. He had already familiarized himself with the environment during these days. Therefore, he had lowered his awareness when moving around the forest. It was an everyday routine for him. During his hunt, he went onto a route that he was extremely familiar with. It was the route that he had took many times, and it was the safest road to him. But suddenly, he stepped on something strange. It looked to be 2 giant elephants' teeth that clamped through his legs. The pain that he suffered when he stepped onto the trap made him furious. It was so painful that he screamed repeatedly. He didn't know what it was, but he was certain that it belonged to the humans. After a while, he realized that even though the trap looked scary, it wasn't particularly painful, and it only injured him a tiny bit. It didn't even break the bones of his leg. It was just a sharp serrated tooth that tore his skins with the muscle of his lower legs. Most importantly, the trap was easy to break, too. All he did was to gather up all his strength and pry it open with his hands. However, his injured legs still needed to be treated. All the precious medical supplies were left back in his camp. Therefore, all he could now was to limp back slowly to his camp so that he could treat his wound. As Simon treated his wound, he thought to himself, there have been sightings of humans around this area, and it was no longer safe to stay here. It looked like they may have to move to another area. With Simon's mount Wolf Blackwind having to give birth in these upcoming few days, the best time to move away would be tomorrow. To Simon, the quicker they moved, the better. With the birth of a small mount wolf, they will lose all their mobility. All of a sudden, Simon's nose picked up a different scent in the air. It was the scent of humans. Simon then ferociously stood up with a worried facial expression on his face and looked around carefully to scan for any danger. Abel observed with extreme caution as the wagon got up and peeked around. Suddenly, Abel realized the wagon must have sensed his presence from a distance. As a wagon, Simon had an extremely strong and terrifying sense of smell. The moment he picked up the scent of Abel, Simon knew that this human was the one who injured him. These inferior humans would need to use such despicable methods to injure him. He was ready to do anything he could to find the bastard who did this and wipe him out the surface of the earth. When Abel realized that he was spotted by the wagon was already dashing directly towards his direction from afar. At that moment, Abel knew he was in big trouble. For the vigorous look of this wagon, it at least possessed the fighting ability of a novice knight, which to say this wolf rider was at least level 6. While Abel was only a rank 5 novice knight, he was only one rank away from being in rank 6. However, the probation between knights that were level 1 to 5 only had one combat chi force. The power of the force was determined through level-based, level 1 being the weakest while level 5 being the strongest. However, the combat chi was only available to fire once at a time, since novice knights did not have a quarter generation more combat chi. Therefore, once they used up all their chi in their meridian, it would require at least a few days for them to recover before using it again. The combat chi was like an amplifier for power. If a professional could produce around 500 pounds of force, his combat chi would be capable of doubling that power to 1,000 pounds. For level 6 professional, they can use the combat chi multiple times, thus multiplying their attacking strength. However, level 5 or below only has one shot to double the strength. Therefore, their difference in strength could not be matched no matter how good the weapons and accessories are. If Abel used his large sword against Simon the wagon, the only outcome would be that Abel being excluded by the force of the sword, while Simon only slowed down a bit by the ice magic of the sword. When Abel thought about it, he suddenly had an idea. He wasn't going to fight the wagon. Since he saw the injury on the wagon's legs, maybe he could have a chance to escape. When Simon saw that the man, not only was he unwilling to engage in combat but was turning around and running away, he thought to himself, what a coward that human was. With little regard to his injury, Simon began to make a chase after Abel. Originally, Abel thought that since the wagon's leg was injured, he surely would have run faster than the wagon. However, the wagon was still the fastest predator in the Holy Continent. Ever since Simon began to chase after Abel, he had been catching up closer and closer to his speed at every second. Abel estimated his current distance to the wagon. If he used the exploding sword with a 3-second wait time, he could cause severe damage or even kill the wagon. However, with all these forests nearby, with the speed of the wagon, it could use these trees as cover and dodge the majority blast. The exploding sword only had one attack. The best chance for Abel would have been when the wagon was unprepared for his attack. However, if the first attempt was unsuccessful, the second attempt would be even less likely to succeed as the wagon would have raised his awareness. Abel took out a crossbow, which was already loaded with an arrow. He immediately looked back and aimed at the head of the wagon and fired. The wagon had extremely precise reaction time. He instantly dodged the arrow. The wagon was now even closer. Abel realized he didn't have any time left to reload his crossbow, so he made a quick decision. Abel threw his crossbow directly at the wagon, who was rapidly catching up to him. The wagon's paws caught the crossbow in the air, and within seconds, the crossbow became a pile of trash on the ground. With not much time left, Abel lastly took out the crossbow made by the dwarf. However, he only got the chance to fire it once before it became useless again. with no more ranged weapons equipped with Abel. The only option now was to use the trees to distance himself from the wagon. Abel kept changing directions. By doing so, he could slowly keep his current distance against the wagon. As Abel sprinted, Abel quickly caught a glimpse of a familiar sign with the corner of his eyes. He realized that it was the trap he had set earlier. Simon became more and more frantic. The blood of the orc seemed to boil within him. He gave a great shout, and his muscles were immediately all ferociously tensed. It even transformed him from 2 meters large into 2.5 meters. Simon's speed seemed to change significantly too. Abel suddenly felt the wagons breathing behind him. When he looked at the sign again, he was already at his trap that he set earlier. He lunged forward as he held his ground between the 2 traps that were placed on the ground. The front hand of the trap flipped, which turned over the second trap. This allowed Abel to escape the attack from the wagon claw from behind. The wagon screamed with a cry of "Ow, tilde tilde." Simon's legs were caught again. As he ran, the chain of the gigantic trap was tied to the tree pole at one end, and the strong pulling force caused Simon to fall onto the ground. Abel saw the wagon lying down on the ground, and before the wagon's hand could pull open the clamp, Abel had pulled out an exploding sword from the Heraldric cube. Before the white light flashing in the explosion of the sword, Abel was already on the ground taking cover, and the light shield at the waist was tilted in front of him to protect him from the explosion. Simon saw a bright, shining white sword flying towards him. It was not moving very fast, which surprised him. But at the same time, an instinctive sense of fear arose from the depths of his body. Then immediately the sword exploded. There was a loud bang, and Abel's shield jingled in front of him. When everything became quiet, he stood up, and the trapped wagon was covered in blood. Particularly in the middle of its fear-filled eyes, a hole was gushing out blood. A piece of debris had directly struck the wagon on its head. Abel approached the wagon. The wagon, who was 2.5 meters in shape, had transformed back to 2 meters upon its death. Due to the transformation of the wagon earlier, the clothes made from the fur on its body have broken open and something was protruding outside. As Abel took out that something from the blood-smeared wagon, it was a sheepskin paper. On the paper was some kind of orc's text with a map and some strange piece of branding. On the brand was carved with a long curved horn and a lion's face. The lion looked to have more developed muscles of the body than a normal human, along with sharp claws on its hand followed by a pair of toe shoes. The lion was the god of the orcs. As Abel investigated further, he found that at the bottom of the brand, there was a star. If there were orcs here, they would have known the importance of this sign. These were special orc ability skill cards. Each sign was sealed with a powerful ability. Because most of the orcs had no written language, the orc gods used this method to preserve these skills, and the orcs learned the skills through these signs. The sign that Abel found had another star. This meant that still another opportunity was special to learn the special orc ability. Even though it was not known where Simon had gotten the special orc sign, but the rarity of this orc sign was beyond doubt even for ordinary orcs.